This is a Labour Live's short talk on the general strike of 1926 and the make-up of local politics in Birmingham at that time, and how that period affected Labour politics. Exactly 90 years ago, Birmingham had seen an 8-day strike on the streets of this city, and yet we seem to have forgotten it. The general strike of 1926 was almost inevitable. It was predominantly an act of solidarity with the miners' union. However, in examining 1926, we must go back a few years. Nationally, the Labour Party had witnessed the downfall of the first Labour government in 1924 and fresh elections later that year. The First World War had meant that many of the levers of industry were coming directly from Westminster. Local government played a lesser part in people's lives. The benefits and bounce of the First World War did not have sustained impetus for manufacturing generally, as the economic situation worsened with declining wages and increased unemployment. Britain was in a parlous economic state, as was Europe and the Empire. The social situation of the working class in pre- and post-First World War Birmingham was not much better than it had been over the preceding few decades. Housing was still poor in large sections of the city. Life expectancy was markedly worse than the prosperous sections of the city, and many returned from the war disabled and disillusioned. World War I had stalled civic progress in the main. The political map of Birmingham was still much the same as it had been for very many years. In 1914, the last election before the First World War, the political parties agreed to avoid an electoral contest. Out of 30 wards, 29 went unopposed. In 1915, the Elections and Registration Act suspended all municipal elections and extended the term of office of sitting councillors for 1 year. Subsequent legislation ensured that no elections took place during the First World War at all, and all casual vacancies were filled by appointment. The election of 1919 was a wholly different affair. Labour made many gains. It was involved with a coalition of different parties, which included the Cooperative Party, the Progressive Party, and various independent candidates. As a result of that election, Labour took 9 seats, the Conservatives, or Unionists as they were known locally, 9, Progressives and the Cooperative 3, Liberals 2, Independents 2, with a lone Tenants Association councillor. Unfortunately, Labour stuttered at the next election in 1920. The Conservative Party and its allies won 23 seats, with the Liberals and their allies 14, and Labour could only get 2 councillors elected, in Saltley and in Aston. In 1920, locally it was possible, as a Labour supporter, to run on a ticket of Labour and the Communist Party. In the Yardley ward, Henry Shepperton stood as a Labour and Communist Party candidate and said that he was a supporter of the Russian Bolsheviks. He was quoted as saying, "I stand for the dictatorship of the workers in order to build up, as in Russia, a workers' republic, based on workers' councils organised industrially where they work and socially where they live." But only 357 of the electorate supported him. 1921 saw a resurgence for Labour, with it gaining 10 seats. The Conservatives took 16 and the Liberal Party 3. Again, there was a lone independent. 1922 saw the Conservatives consolidate their hold on the council, winning 17 seats against Labour's 8. The local elections of 1924 was another bad year for the Labour Party. They gained with their allies only 5 seats, while the Conservatives and their allies took a massive 23. The fall of the first Labour government had not helped locally the Labour cause in Birmingham. The 1924 general election had 12 parliamentary seats up for grabs in Birmingham. At that time, all the seats were held by the Conservatives. The one glimmer of sunshine came at Birmingham Kings Norton, where Labour won with Robert Denison, a trade union official, defeating Sir Herbert Austin, the sitting MP. Austin had reportedly been threatening to close his Austin works within the constituency if he was defeated, and his personal unpopularity and neglect of his constituency duties were believed sufficient explanation for his defeat. Fellow Birmingham MP and Conservative Neville Chamberlain called Austin the worst representative I have ever come across, and never attending the House of Commons or doing anything in his constituency. One needs to remember that the minority Labour government of Ramsay MacDonald, which had taken office only in January 1924, had to go to the country again in October 1924 because of the fake Zinoviev letter. The local Birmingham Post headlines for the 17th of October 1924 was "Fighting Against the Red Flag." Labour did make inroads into other constituencies in Birmingham, but not enough to win, and the Tories secured a massive 17,000 majority in Birmingham Moseley constituency. However, things were slightly different in Birmingham Ladywood, which you might think would be a natural Labour stronghold. The seat was held by Neville Chamberlain, son of Joseph, but he only just won it that year by some 77 votes. His opponent was the charismatic Sir Oswald Mosley, fighting his first election under Labour colours. Mosley ran the campaign attacking the recent introduction of the Rent Act, an act that had profound implications for local residents in Ladywood. Mosley called it the most monstrous piece of class legislation that ever disgraced the statute book. The declaration of the vote at the town hall was rowdy. The Birmingham Labour Party newspaper, the Town Crier, demanded yet another recount in Ladywood. Rumours abounded about a vote fix, and it was said that a ballot steward, identified as a Chamberlain supporter, was seen flushing ballot papers down the toilet. One wonders what the history of the UK would have been if Neville Chamberlain had lost his seat in 1924. 1925 saw another bad election result for Labour in Birmingham. They managed to secure only 6 seats, while the Unionists, the Conservatives, took 23. So this was the climate in which the strike was fought. The attack on the miners had been going on since 1920. Industrially, the disputes in the mining industry which led to the general strike demonstrate the most visible evidence of the post-war decline in British trade and industry. Mine owners tried to reduce the workforce in the mines and to cut wages. In June 1925, the mine owners embarked upon a fresh round of attacks on miners' wages. The General Council of the Trade Union Congress responded by calling on the transport workers and the railway workers to impose an embargo on the movement of coal. Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister intervened, and on the 30th of July, on what became known as Red Friday, the government agreed to pay a temporary subsidy to the mine owners in order to maintain the miners' wages and hours. However, behind the scenes, the government was preparing and drawing up plans in case of a full general strike. Civil commissioners were set up through the country, and in October 1925 a headquarters and staff were set up in the West Midlands under the civil authority of Lieutenant Colonel G.E. Stanley MP. The government was preparing for what they thought was the inevitable strike. In Birmingham in 1925, as we moved through the winter of 1926, wages in the city were low. Birmingham employers were so successful at driving down wages that the city was well below the average for the country as a whole. Skilled steel workers were averaging only £2 a week in 1926, plumbers slightly less, and many men in the city on full-time, unskilled employment were earning no more than 30 shillings, £1.50 per week. This was when average rates of pay in the south of England gave skilled craftsmen approximately £3.15 shillings a week. At a public meeting in Aston on Sunday the 18th of April 1926, under the auspices of the Young Socialist League and the Aston Divisional Labour Party, young socialists were invited to volunteer to maintain the Labour press service in the event of a strike. Preparations were being made on both sides of this dispute. And by the time of the 1926 May Day procession, there was little doubt that such a strike would take place in Birmingham. 1926's May Day March and rally was the biggest in the city's history. The president of the Trades Council spelt out the determination of the unions. The workers must show their strength is equal to the government. The time is come for the workers to form an army against misery and starvation. The Birmingham Labour newspaper, the Town Crier, quoted approvingly the statement made by John Wheatley, a former Minister of Housing in the Labour government and a prominent left-winger. The miners occupied the front trench of the position singled out for attack, and if their wages are reduced, it will be the beginning of the policy of general wages reduction. So then in May 1926, there were more than 25,000 workers marching in the procession, and a further 100,000 workers and their families lining the streets. The Labour Party and the cooperative movement pledged themselves to support the miners. However, in the absence of direct links with the mining industry, and with its notoriously weak and fragmented trade union base, little was expected of Birmingham by the Labour movement. The Birmingham Trades Union Emergency Committee coordinated strike activities in Birmingham, and the initial response to the strike call was positive. On the 4th of May 1926, Birmingham was without the bulk of its passenger transport, and local newspapers failed to appear. Sir Oswald Mosley stepped in and offered to set up the printing press in the Labour Party headquarters in Corporation Street. A professional manager was brought in, and it was edited by Mosley's close political ally, John Strachey. The paper was eventually closed when several of the people were arrested, including most of the members of the Birmingham Trade Union Emergency Committee. The Birmingham Strike Bulletin had been published for 8 days, but the authorities came in eventually and closed it down. So the early days of the strike were positive. The city began to grind to a halt. The Corporation of Birmingham was clearly surprised by this show of solidarity by its workers. Local newspapers, led by the anti-union proprietor Sir Charles Hyde of the Birmingham Post and Birmingham Mail, soon had to bring out a poor quality duplicated sheet put together by management, as their workers refused to cross picket lines. Over the next few days, the strike continued, but without the closure of gas, electricity and other essentials, it was doomed to failure. Normal life carried on in the city. Offices, schools, libraries opened as normal, and public entertainment was only affected in part. Cinemas, nightclubs, theatres continued, especially gaining popularity in suburban areas. Only Aston Villa's game against West Bromwich as a charity match was delayed. The strike did not stop Warwickshire County Cricket Club opening the home programme against Hampshire, with some 3,000 people attending. Birmingham was estimated to have stocks of groceries for up to 4 weeks. Fish supplies were plentiful, as was fresh vegetables. Milk trains were exempt by the railwaymen from strike action. Whilst the tramways were not working due to the solid support of the transport workers, There was a plentiful amount of petrol about, and private cars began to try and break the strike. Later the police became involved in escorting volunteer drivers. 4 days into the strike, a large contingent of police, together with mounted horse, entered the Tennant Street depot in Ladywood and ordered away the transport workers' pickets. Inside, all the buses had been parked in the most awkward positions possible. Birmingham had been used to emergency powers being enacted, as with the Emergency Powers Act of 1920. Then came the Emergency Regulations of 1926. An order was signed by the Chief Constable on the 7th of May, and from then on things began to change. The police clearly played an important part in the demoralisation of local workers and activists. The police attended meetings looking for information and the evidence of supposed statements that might be actionable under the emergency powers. They employed spies. Amongst those arrested during the strike were 2 Labour councillors, George Sawyer and Percy Shermer. Sawyer had made a speech to a meeting in Nechel's Green, in which he was alleged to have said of the Special Constabulary, "They are nothing more than a body of traitors, and each member should be looked upon as a suspicious person. But I must not say too much about them, as I am a member of the Watch Committee, and they serve under me." He was arrested at his home the following lunchtime, but the police refused to give him precise information about the charge. News of the arrival of the police at Sawyer's home travelled around the neighbourhood, and he was accompanied to the station by a crowd seeking to bail him. The police did, however, accept Sawyer's own surety for bail, and eventually he was bound over. Sawyer's arrest was referred to in the House of Commons on Monday, May the 10th. The Labour MP Morgan Jones uses an example of the way in which even moderate Labour men were being prosecuted. Percy Shermer's arrest came on Sunday the 9th of May, when there was a mass rally at Calthorpe Park. Some 20,000 people turned up, and the police took objection to part of the speech made by Shermer. At Shermer's trial it was alleged that he had made vile insinuations against the police. He was said to have referred to the crowd incidents in Broad Street on that Saturday, and to have told the rally, "We are not ready yet, but I have been in the front line in Flanders and in France, and I will be in the front line again to lead you and to die for you if necessary." In his defence, Councillor Shermer declared that his remarks had been directed towards the preservation of order. He was fined £10. At a rally in the Bullring, Communist Party member John Trotter was arrested for calling the special constables a bunch of hooligans. Trotter refused to plead guilty at his trial, and in fact seems to have refused to accept that the court was anything other than there to crush the working class movement. His comments resulted in him receiving 3 months hard labour. He was one of many people throughout the whole country who served prison sentences on what would appear to be fairly trumped up evidence. Various people were tried days after the end of the strike. Needless to say, all of the defendants were found guilty at Birmingham Magistrates Court, and either fined £10 or bound over for 6 months. This included the people who had been running the Labour presses. The stipendiary magistrate, Lord Ilkerson, had no truck with any legal arguments. None of the defendants had had previous convictions, and 4 were magistrates that appeared in the very court that they were convicted in. So, within 2 days of the strike being called off, the state was ensuring it showed no quarter. Over several days the strike petered out. It ended when the TUC called off the strike. Many workers in Birmingham were unhappy at this decision. Union membership after the strike fell considerably. Political action was taken up by the Labour Party itself. Sir Oswald Mosley claimed at a post-strike rally that we fought a defensive fight this time. Next time we will fight an offensive fight at the general election. So exactly 90 years ago, where exactly was the Labour Party, and how did it feel? The buoyancy of the Birmingham Labour Party came about because it believed that the movement could now move from trade union militancy through militancy in the ballot box. The growing popularity of the Birmingham Labour Party was to culminate in the 1929 general election, when the Birmingham Party captured half the seats in the city. It was only to be when the MacDonald administration collapsed in 1931 that the political side of the Labour movement suffered a comparable disillusionment to that suffered by the trade union movement as a result of the general strike. However, things were different in the local elections. The 1926 local elections saw Labour take 12 seats in the city, whilst the Conservatives and their allies took 16. In 1927, Labour saw the Conservatives and their allies take 21 seats, with Labour only managing 9. The 1928 local elections saw the Conservatives and their allies take 18 and Labour 10. The election of 1930 saw the Conservatives take an overwhelming 25 seats against Labour's 5. 1931 in the city was a very bad year for Labour. And out of 31 seats contested, the Conservatives took 29. The Liberals won, an Independent took 1, and there was not one single Labour seat won. The last election before the Second World War in 1938 saw Labour suffering another heavy defeat. Conservatives taking 29, with Labour only gaining 4 seats. Normal elections did not resume until the election of 1945. This was after the general election, and in the local elections that came that year, the electorate put their faith in Labour, with 47 councillors being elected, 13 Conservatives, and none for the Liberals. Labour took 55.6% of the vote and was the high watermark for Labour at that time. So, some 20 years after the general strike in Birmingham, Labour were back in power. I've been assisted considerably by the Birmingham Public Library's publication, The 9 Days in Birmingham, which is specifically on the general strike in 1926. So as we remember those momentous days 90 years ago, I'd like to say to you, thank you for listening to this Labour Lives podcast on Labour politics in the 1920s, and more specifically Labour and the general strike of 1926.